A little over a year ago, I bought what many consider to be the best LPVO on the market right now, especially for civilian shooters, the Primary Arms PLXC 1-8X. Now, this particular scope is very good, and it actually started out on my MCX Spear chambered in 7.62 NATO. But shortly thereafter, I actually moved it over to my BCM Recce 16 chambered in 5.56 because I wanted it to be my optic setup on my go-to rifle. And for the last year, it was. And so I've used it, I've gotten a lot of experience with it, and I've learned a lot about it. And during that time, I figured out that even though it's the best LPVO on the market in many ways, especially regarding the value it provides at its price point, I've still decided to get rid of it. I'm gonna toss it. And not because it's a bad optic, because it's just not working for what I want. And I gave it a very good try, but we are moving on. So in this video, I want to tell you about the optic itself, about the reasons why I've decided it's not going to work for me and why I'm getting rid of it. And then I'm going to tell you about what its replacement will be and why, and we'll compare the two because there are some interesting comparisons there, especially regarding price and weight. So hopefully this video will give you some things to consider, especially if you're in the market for an LPVO, because this is one of the best out there right now. And so my reasons for why I'm getting rid of it might give you some other things to consider before making a purchase or before making any other decisions. And now, of course, before we jump into it, I want to mention that Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel. And thanks to them, I can actually get hands-on experience with equipment like the Primary Arms PLXC 1-8X, you see right here, and give you my honest feedback about it, which is the best part about my Midway USA partnership. There is no filter. My honesty is all you'll ever get, and they're okay with that, which is what I greatly appreciate about them. So, big thanks to Midway USA. Now, let's start with the optic itself, and let's talk about what's good about it, okay? So the PLXC 1-8X LPVO from Primary Arms is an excellent LPVO. I chose the Raptor M8 Yards reticle. Now, I wanted that reticle because it's more simplified. There isn't any dialing or anything considered like there might be with the ACSS Griffin Mill reticle. This is just a bullet drop compensation reticle that has ranging features built in as well. And so that allows me to get on target quickly without having to worry about turrets or anything like that, while also being able to range and hit targets at distance, all within just the reticle, which I greatly appreciate. Now, the reticle itself is excellent on 1X. For being a first focal plane scope, that is a huge positive because generally that's where first focal plane LPVOs struggle. But the 1X on this LPVO is amazing. It is very crisp, very good glass clarity, and the reticle works very well because it has these large, thick crosshairs that come in from the outside edges and allows you to see the actual reticle in the very center because your eye is drawn to it. Whereas the floating reticles you get in some of the less expensive Primary Arms LPVOs or even other LPVO designs that are out there generally are harder to find with your eye at that 1X range due to the fact that in a first focal plane scope, the reticle has to shrink at the lower magnification levels and then of course increases in size the higher up you go in magnification. So everything regarding that performance is good, and the glass clarity is excellent. It is HD Japanese glass, or ED. I'm not sure anymore what we're doing with these acronyms, but I do know that the glass is very good. And so that is tip-top as well. Now, a very big consideration for this particular optic that leads a lot of people to selecting it is its overall size. So it's very compact. It only has an overall length of 9.28 inches. Which is very short. So that allows you to have a little bit more space on your rail or on your receiver and gives you some more options regarding accessories. And the weight is very good as well. For a 1-8X LPVO, the weight comes in at 17 ounces, which is very hard to beat with this particular optic. Now, of course, that doesn't include a mount or anything else, but just for the optic itself, that's still very lightweight. Now, this optic is expensive. It's $1,500. But it's a very good value at that price point. What do I mean by that? Because $1,500 should just be expensive and you should get something good for that regardless, right? Well, unfortunately, it is actually punching up for its weight class regarding price point because it's actually hanging out with some of the higher end optics that are out there regarding Vortex Razor HDs, or possibly your Night Force NX8s, or even getting up there towards, Night Force Attackers, or Calais or some of these other LPVOs that are really expensive but really high quality. And so for $1,500, this LPVO gives you a lot of those higher end features and qualities that you have to spend $2,000 to $3,000 for sometimes at a $1,500 price point. So that is very attractive in the sense of getting a lot for your money, even though it is a lot of money, right? So I would say it's the best value in its class. Although it's still expensive, it has a lot of value, and you're really hitting the edge of diminished returns as soon as you go past the PLXC from Primary Arms. Now, obviously with an LPVO, you need a mount. It doesn't come with a mount, and it is something you have to purchase separately. So the mount that I currently have this in is the PLX cantilever 30mm mount from Primary Arms. I figured they pretty much made that mount for this optic, and I wanted to experience how things are supposed to work, right? So that's the mount that I chose, and that mount is $260. It's made out of 7075 aluminum, it's very strong, and it's made in the USA, which I find to be impressive. The optic is made in Japan, so just so you're aware of that. Now, it does also have the PLX top cap RMR mount. Now, what this is it is a top ring mount that you actually swap one of the top ring pieces out for, and then you're able to mount an RMR or RMR footprint capable optic on top, which many people opt to do. And the optic that I chose for this particular setup is the Meprolite MPO Pro F. Now, the top cap itself was another $60, and the Meprolite is $320, which is expensive, but for what it is actually a decent value because it's a fully enclosed emitter red dot sight, and it comes with an RMR adapter plate, so that way it would actually fit directly on this top cap without any issues, which you can see here clearly it does. And so now I have a fully enclosed emitter, which I find to be a requirement when it comes to using it on a rifle, and at the same time from a company, Meprolite, that has a good track record of making decent quality optics. So that optic, like I said, $320, not cheap, but not the most expensive. And then you also have the top cap and the mount and the optic. So all in all, in total, this is a $2,140 optics package. And the entire package weighs in at 27 ounces. So now you know how it all works together. What are the reasons for why I'm getting rid of it? Because that might be more important. I've spent, like I said, a year with this optic, and it's been very good, and it is one of the best LPVOs out there. And it might not be this particular optic that I have issues with. It might just still be LPVOs in general. I made a video a while back about my LPVO mistakes to avoid. And this LPVO still actually makes some of those mistakes, but I wanted to try what many told me was one of the best LPVOs out there to give LPVOs the best chance I could before deciding against the concept in general. And I even actually reached out to Brass Facts about it because he seems to be the LPVO guru, and he definitely suggested the PLXC as being an excellent option. Now, why am I getting rid of it? If it's so good, and it's such a good value for its price point, and it has all the excellent features of an LPVO, why would you get rid of it, Magic? You might ask. Well, I asked myself the same question a couple of times before I made the decision. First off, an LPVO is already a compromise. In order to get good 1x performance in the optic, you are sacrificing many things in many ways, but you need 1x performance because that's the entire concept of an LPVO. An LPVO is a 1x optic that has a higher magnification top end of 4, 6, 8, or even 10 in some cases. It is not a 10x, 8x, 6x, or 4x optic that has a 1x setting. The 1x is the priority of an LPVO, and everything else is forced to work around that priority, okay? That limits some features and functions. For example, LPVOs generally don't have a parallax adjustment. Now, I believe there are some on the market now that do, but it is very rare, and it is probably not overly needed, but it does limit your capabilities at range, and it can affect your point of impact based on parallax, which means you need to have the exact same setting regarding where your eye is in relation to the optic every time you pull the trigger to avoid parallax issues once you're past the point of the set parallax, right? Which every LPVO has a different one. It's either 100 yards, 150 yards, sometimes it's 125. It all depends on different manufacturers, but it's still an issue regardless of what it's set at, based on the fact that if you don't have the exact alignment every single time you're behind the optic, you might be off regarding parallax. Now, it's also limiting and restricting your reticle design. The reticle has to be good at 1x. And if you're a first focal plane optic, which you generally prefer because it makes your bullet drop compensation actually work at any magnification level, and that is kind of important when it comes to LPVOs, which I'll tell you about here in a second, you have to have something that works at 1x, and that has to be prioritized over whatever you get at 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever it may be. And so you are limiting the design parameters of that reticle based on the fact that you need that 1x to work as well as possible, okay? So anything else thereafter is just a benefit, but the requirement is what it can do at 1x. And this optic does a great job at 1x. But of course, for all I know, at 8x, it might be sacrificing some things that would be nice to have that we're dealing with now because of what 1x required. For example, the outer ring on the reticle could be a little bit thinner, which would allow me to see more of the field of view whenever I'm trying to get on target, but unfortunately, it has to be that thick so you can see it well on 1x. So you can see what I'm saying here is that it creates issues. Another problem is that because of the design of LPVOs in general and needing that 1x, they generally don't allow for as much light transmission. You know, you have a smaller objective lens, you have a limit on the size of the tube and everything else, and basically, you're just limited on overall light transmission, which makes its use in low light scenarios a little bit worse than that of a traditional rifle scope, and also limits your capability at range regarding glass clarity. So all those things are sacrificed to have a good 1x performance. And one of the biggest issues, which we can talk about regarding the reticle situation, is that you are now stuck with this reticle that you almost need to have in the first focal plane, because at the top end of your magnification, everything becomes much more difficult to use. Your eye relief is more strict, let's just say. The eye box itself is tighter, and you have to have a perfect placement in order to get a sight picture on maximum magnification, which you can actually see in some of the footage I may have already rolled into this video. When I zoom all the way in with my camera setup behind the optic at full magnification, I can't get a full sight picture because of how tight the eye box is regarding the lens on the camera. So it does cause issues even with a camera. Imagine what it does with your actual eye. So it creates all sorts of issues, and now you have to back your magnification down so you can actually use it more easily. And that's why first focal plane becomes more of a requirement, because now that BDC I'm relying on, rather than dialing, is only calibrated if first focal plane is in use. Whereas if it was second focal plane, only the center aiming point would still be zeroed properly, basically. Okay, so moving on from there. Like I said, this applies to LPVOs in general, not just the PLXC, and this is why I got one of the best LPVOs out there, so I could develop a good, well-rounded, experience-based opinion by using a quality optic rather than writing things off because of using something cheap that just wasn't good to begin with. This is a very good optic. And these things still come into play here, which is why this decision had to be made. Now, another factor is that once a top dot is added, okay, the red dot you see on top here, once you add an offset dot, whether or not it's at the 45-degree angle or at the piggyback mount here at the 12 o'clock, it changes the dynamic of everything. And suddenly, all the compromises and all the restrictions that you've placed on this optic in order to have a great 1x performance are no longer worth the sacrifice, because you now have 1x performance in your secondary optic that is still better, at least in my experience, in my opinion, still better and easier to use than the 1x in the LPVO. And so anytime I want to use 1x, I'm using the red dot because it's just naturally easier to acquire, except for in very niche situations where your body positioning doesn't allow for it in the sense of how high it is above the bore, okay? So there are some situations where it becomes a problem, especially if you're on barricades or you're prone behind cover or something like that. It can be problematic, but in general, if I'm running a 1x, I'm using the red dot. Now, I have the red dot there for some practical reasons, you know. I can use it for passive aiming under night vision, which isn't a priority, but it is something that is a capability that I like to have, Because night vision for me is a good thing to have and a utility to have, but it's not a priority when it comes to my rifles or my weapon loadouts, because I don't necessarily feel it is a requirement for me to be able to night fight on a regular basis. But if it comes up and I have the capacity to use passive aiming, I can still do it if need be, right? Does that make sense? I hope so. But that's why it's there. It gives me that. It gives me a redundant aiming solution. So if the optic goes down or something happens, I have two aiming solutions in case of an issue, right? A backup is always a good idea. But by adding it to get those redundancies and night vision capabilities, I have used it over the 1X on my LPVO because I prefer it. It's parallax free. It's easy to get behind. It doesn't have an eye box or anything like that. There's no eye relief. So I look up at the optic and I can shoot. It's better on 1X, in my experience, for me personally. So that makes the 1X on the LPVO not very great in the sense of usefulness. So once the red dot is added to this package, a lot of things suddenly become problematic that wouldn't be otherwise. And they're only problematic because they are compromised due to the priority of your 1X performance on the LPVO. And I'm not really using the 1X on the LPVO, although that's what it's supposed to be for. Now, could I solve this issue by getting rid of the red dot? Yes, and that's what I would suggest if you want to run an LPVO personally. If I want to run an LPVO now, my goal is to run just the LPVO. I know that won't work with passive aiming. I know that might create some issues, for redundancy purposes or whatever else it might be. But the point of an LPVO is to have an all-in-one optics package. And that's where the sacrifices and the compromises start to make sense. But if you're not going to only rely on the LPVO for your 1X performance, you now have an LPVO that's limited on everything except for 1X that you're not even using the 1X for, at least for me. And that's where my decision had to be made. Now, there's also some issues with the PLXC that are problematic too. And those issues are interesting as well. So what are those issues? Well, one of the worst ones for me is that the PLXC's throw lever is just in a bad location. The throw lever works very well. It's smooth. It's strong enough to generally avoid being bumped around too easily, but it's smooth enough to move quickly. If you need magnification suddenly, or if you need to lower your magnification suddenly, it's a very good throw lever. The problem is that because of its location, it does get caught on my gear regularly. Now, I know they make a folding throw lever I could replace this with, but I don't necessarily trust that either, because now we're adding an additional mechanism and something that's still protruding in the same position, but just folded down, which means if it was to unfold, things would get even worse than they are now for me. And if it stays folded, there's no guarantee it still won't accomplish the same goal that this one seems to have, which is moving me off of 1X. In my experience, and at least based on the information I have, if you're carrying an LPVO, you generally want it set to 1X. The reason for that is that you're always at your baseline standard of magnification, and you can move up from there where needed, but you're never over magnified the second you jump into the scope. And so I've been in that situation before where I forgot I left the scope on like 4X or 6X or whatever it was, and then I pull the rifle up and I realize I'm way out of bounds when it comes to trying to get on target, and I have to mess with the magnification, and everything falls apart very quickly. So I generally try to keep my LPVOs on 1X because I can adjust from there, and even at there I can usually make the shot if need be. But on this particular model, the throw lever is in a position that allows it to be manipulated by a chest rig or a plate carrier or any type of gear I'm wearing on my chest while carrying the rifle slung, which is generally how most people are carrying their rifles these days. And you can even see on the actual throw lever itself, there's damage on it from rubbing up and down on magazines, whether or not they're metal magazines like Stanags, or even if they're just plastic magazines like PMags. Whatever magazines I'm carrying in a chest rig or in a plate carrier are rubbing on this throw lever and causing it to move out of 1X. So then I suddenly go to lift up the rifle, doing a drill or something along those lines, and now my magnification is either at 1.5 or it's at 2, and sometimes it's been as bad as getting all the way to 3, depending on how bad the throw lever got caught on my gear. So that to me is an issue with this particular optic, not necessarily with all LPVOs, but it is a consideration to make on this particular optic. I find it to be annoying and I find it to be problematic with how often it actually impacts my ability to keep the optic on the magnification setting that I want it to be on, okay? Now, another issue with this particular optic is that the eye relief is very strict. It is, let's just say, strange how it actually works in use versus on paper. On paper, it has an eye relief of 3.5 inches. But in use, it has to be really far forward on my receiver for me to get a good full sight picture. And that causes me issues because I only have one click of adjustment left in my stock to pull it out further when I get into other positions to get behind this optic properly. And that causes me issues, especially when going prone. This optic can be tough to get behind in the prone position because of how restrictive the eye box and the eye relief is. And I don't necessarily understand the math behind it because a 3.5-inch eye relief should be good and relatively easy to work with. But for some reason with this optic, it is hard to get behind. You can see how far forward on the receiver I have it mounted just to get a good eye picture or like sight picture, which is not the same as an eye picture, but a good sight picture when using the rifle in most situations. It's all the way forward at the very last slot on my upper receiver. And that's with a cantilever mount. And then if I go prone, things get even more difficult. So that is another issue specific to this optic, but that is an issue that does happen to other LPVOs as well. So it's definitely something for you to consider. Your LPVO might work great when you're using it in a standard standing position or something along those lines. But if you go prone or you go into other awkward positions, you can suddenly find yourself wishing you had more adjustment in your stock to get a proper eye relief, which is problematic at times, okay? It's just been my experience. Now, could you get a different mount that's even got a longer cantilever that allows you to get a little bit further forward on your handguard? Yes, you could. But this is the mount that I got, the mount that I started with, and I don't know if I really should have to get an entirely new mount to accomplish something that it already should be able to do. Yes, it's something I would do if I wanted to keep this optic, but it's not something I'm going to do because I'm not keeping the optic. Now, the last thing about this particular optic that isn't necessarily related to all other LPVOs, but is something to consider, and one of the reasons why I'm swapping it out, is that there isn't enough field data for this optic for me to be overly comfortable about it lasting in regards to durability and longevity in a emergency type scenario where a rifle like this would actually need to be used for more than just home defense. That data doesn't exist, and I can tell you at the bare minimum that the illumination, which isn't very important to me on an LPVO or generally in magnified optics in general, but the illumination does not last very long in this optic at all and just randomly is dead. And I don't turn it on. It's on the off position pretty much always. And even just today when I was shooting it, it didn't work. So the batteries just die. Maybe they get leached while they're in there or some other stuff happens. But for some reason, illumination just wasn't happening for me today, even though I didn't ever have it on to begin with, but I have tested it before. So that's just something that kind of comes to mind in the sense of like, could that be a problem? If that's going wrong, what else could go wrong? And we don't have the field data to say that, yes, this particular optic has been out in service with the military or with law enforcement or with all these different agencies for all these years, and we know that it works to this degree and has this level of durability and all these things. It just doesn't have that pedigree, which means I don't know how much I trust it over other optics options that are out there that do have some of that field data. I will say that the Department of Energy did adopt this particular scope recently for some of their enforcement officials, which does tell you that there are people out there who are interested in using it in professional capacities, which is a good sign, but we still don't have as much data for this optic as we do for many other options that are out there. So that's another consideration. So that's the issues I have with the primary arms PLXC 1 to 8X and the issues I have in general with LPVOs. I don't dislike LPVOs, but I just don't think for my purposes they're what I prefer. And especially when it comes to a go-to-war rifle or a rifle that might be used for SHTF purposes. We're talking about austere environments where things get beat up, broken, are exposed to extreme conditions. Those are the things I also consider And when I look at this optic, I just don't know if it'll be okay in that type of an environment. And so I have made a decision to switch to another optics system. And I want to tell you about it because not only do I think it's a generally good concept for the average prepared citizen's fighting rifle, but I also have some comparisons I want to make between it and the PLXC 1 to 8X to give you some ideas about where some benefits might come from swapping out to a different optics system. So let's do that now. Enter the Trijicon ACOG TA02 LED model. Yes, we've gone back to the ACOG. In case you don't remember, I used to have a Wilson Combat Ranger as my go-to rifle with a TA11 3.5X ACOG with an RMR piggyback mounted on top. And now we have the TA02, the LED model, with a Trijicon RCR piggyback mounted in the forward position. I switched to this model because it is 4x magnification, which gives you a little bit more capability in the sense of distance while also having a really good field of view. And it has the forward red dot mounting position, which is better for passive night vision use. I also wanted to try out the LED model because I didn't really like how the fiber optic was a little bit hard to manage. And this model just allows you to use a AA battery to turn the brightness setting to whatever you need or whatever you don't need. And it will last like 15,000 hours, so I'm not overly concerned about it. Now, let's talk about this optic, and then we'll talk about why I swapped it for the PLXC 1 to 8X. And then we'll talk about how they compare, okay? So this particular optic has the 5.56 or the 223 BDC red crosshair reticle. I like the crosshair reticle because it gives you a little bit more to grab onto regarding your eye when you look through the optic and really brings you towards the center, very similarly to how the Raptor M8 reticle does on the primary arms. Now, this at 4x magnification has a huge field of view, and it's also the best glass clarity you will get for this price point from a Prism optic. This is the best glass you'll buy for how much this ACOG costs. It's amazing glass. It looks amazing. It is the best feeling glass to look through, at least that I've experienced so far. And I missed that about my other ACOG setup. I really missed the ACOG, if you can't tell. Now, this overall length is 6 inches. So even smaller than the PLXC 1 to 8X compact LPVO. And it weighs 17.5 ounces with the TA51 mount that it comes with. Now that mount is a little chunky, and it's still only 17.5 ounces with the mount included. So it is lighter weight than the PLXC 1 to 8X, and of course I'll give you the total weight of the optic setup at the end so that way we can compare them. Now, the RCR itself is a whole different story as well. I will tell you though, this ACOG and the RCR, they're very expensive optics. This TA02 was $1,150. That's a lot. But you will not get better glass for $1,150. And you will not get a better Prism optic. It is the best Prism optic on the planet, the ACOG. Whether or not you get the fiber optic or the LED, it doesn't matter. They are the best Prism optics there are. So with that in mind, $1,150 is actually pretty good to get the best version of an optic versus $1,500 for the Primary Arms PLXC, which is really kind of just mid-tier in all honesty regarding price point, not value-wise, but price point, it's in the middle compared to something like a Night Force Attacker, which could be anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000. So for $1,150 to get you the best possible option there is for that type of optic, not super bad. Now the RCR is a whole different story. The RCR is Trigicon's new enclosed emitter red dot optic. So it's the RMR, but now fully enclosed. And it even used the same RMR footprint, which is why I wanted to test it out, because the mount that I had to get for this particular ACOG has the RMR footprint as well. And I find closed emitter optics to be pretty much a necessity on rifles. Not necessarily required on pistols, depending on use case, but for a rifle, I think you need it, because if it snows or rains or does anything like being dusty wherever you are on a regular basis, things will get into that open emitter and you will hate your life. So, enclosed emitter, RCR provides that. It's a 3.25 MOA red dot, and it is $658 on sale. Like that was like bare bottom sale price. Very expensive but it is a RMR footprint and it is direct mounted to RMR mounts, which means you don't have plates or anything else to worry about. So it's very sturdy, and it's made by a company who made the most ruggedized miniature red dot ever built, the RMR. So I trust Trijicon to put out a very high quality, very durable product. And even though it's newer, their track record of reliability and durability comes along with it. And this optic has been tested by other channels, such as Sage Dynamics, where Aaron Cohen drops things on the most ungodly materials ever made, and this thing lasted. So that definitely gives me a little bit of, let's just say, peace of mind. So the RM66 mount that you have to use to put a red dot on the forward mounting position here on the TA02, that was $69. That one, the RM66, is only for the LED ACOG models. So the total optics package here comes out to $1,877. It's a lot of money. And it weighs a total of 21 ounces. Okay. Now let's compare that to the Primary Arms PLXC. It is $263 cheaper. The Primary Arms optics setup was $2,140. The ACOG optics setup is $1,877. This is also 6 ounces lighter than the Primary Arms 1-8X. The Primary Arms setup was 27 ounces. This setup is 21 ounces. So we saved money and we saved weight. But in the process of saving money and weight, we also added some very beneficial features. I guess we'll call them that, because I don't know if this is a feature, but one of the features we added for less money and less weight is a proven design of durability with decades of field testing to show that this optic can survive quite a beating. In fact, it might be the most durable optic ever made. Its only rival, really, are some of the aimpoint optics that are out there that have seen the same amount of field use, which are two of the only optics that we have that much data for, right? So the ACOG is one of the best optics choices you can make as a prepared citizen if you don't want to have to worry about if it's going to break or fail you or just not work. It's hard to beat the durability and the longevity of an ACOG. Now, the RCR is a little bit more of an unknown because it's newer, but it's built off the same design and the same engineering has gone into it as the RMR, which also has that very long track record of durability and reliability. So in all honesty, to me, it very much seems like I got a lot of that with this optic, but just an enclosed emitter in the process, which is extremely beneficial in a rifle setup, in my opinion. Now, another benefit we got by saving money and weight with this optic setup is a simplistic system of use. This is simple. There's no diopter to worry about. There's no throw lever. There's no magnification changing. Yes, the eye relief is tight, but the eye box doesn't feel as tight as the PLXC 1-8X once you get the eye relief correct. And for me, it's not hard to do once it's fully mounted to the rear of the receiver. So I actually don't mind the ACOG's eye relief issue. I find it to be an exaggerated issue in many ways because of the trade-off you get for field of view and extremely good glass clarity. In my opinion, that's worth it. Not to mention the fact that it is so simple. There's nothing to think about. I'm either using the magnified optic at 4x or I'm using the red dot. There is nothing else to consider. And the only other thing I might have to worry about is if I want to turn on the illumination or not. But 95% of the time, I don't want to. So it is bare bones simple. I don't have to think. And I honestly believe if I'm in a situation where I need a rifle like this in the future, SHTF or whatever you want to call it, and I actually have to pull the trigger at some point, I don't know if I'll have the right, sound set of mind in order to go through all the procedures of throwing levers and clicking buttons and everything else. I think as simple as it gets is probably the better way to go. And this optic provides that much better than the LPVO. And another thing we got by saving some money and some weight in this process of swapping out this optic system is that we went from what, like I said, is likely mid-tier quality, right? So we have a Primary Arms optic, which I love Primary Arms. They make great optics, but they are not Night Force. They are not Calais. They are not Trijicon or Leupold or some of those other companies. They just are not. Eventually, sure, and some of their products definitely rival those brands, but we know that there are some quality differences between something like the Night Force attacker line and what Primary Arms produces. So that's a consideration to make. That is more of a mid-tier optic setup in comparison to those top-tier options. Not to mention the red dot is the Mepro light, which is made in the Philippines, but generally good stuff comes from the Philippines. Burris is made there and their stuff is generally good. But regardless, Mepro light, a very unknown optic, don't really have any field data for it, and it's very new as well. Is it going to outlast the RCR? I would bet money that it wouldn't, right? So the whole optic setup is more middle of the road. This optic setup is top tier. This is the top of the line that you can get for your money for this type of optic setup. I have the best prism optic you can buy, and I have what is likely one of the best miniaturized red dot optics on the market right now. This is only rivaled by the Aimpoint Acro, maybe, and maybe the Steiner MPS, right? So this is a top-tier optic stack. Everything here is as high of quality as you can go from a very reputable brand made in the USA by Trijicon, and it's cheaper and less weight than the mid-tier LPVO setup. So those are some of the reasons for why I made the switch. I already have a lot of experience with the ACOG. I've already spent a lot of time with that optic setup, including the red dot on top, and I already know what I do and don't like about it. To me, this just feels right. I think it's the right decision, and I think when it comes to being a prepared citizen, I don't know if I'm going to need a 1 to 8x. I don't know if I'm going to need extended ranges. I don't know what I'll need. And yes, PID can become a problem. I get that 100%. The 4x on an ACOG, when it comes to the clarity and the field of view, it doesn't leave you lacking very much compared to the 6x on an LPVO because of everything else being restricted around it. And that amount of PID you get from that extra 2x or possibly 4x if you go up to 8 is not maybe worth the trade-off of how good the clarity is with this 4x. So there are things to consider there. Not to mention I always carry a secondary magnification solution like a monocular or a pair of binos because recon doesn't always involve pointing a gun at things, right? So these are all considerations that I've made and that I've determined are worth making this swap. And that's why I'm getting rid of the PLXC 1 to 8x. I just might not be an LPVO guy. And I have zero issues with them. If that's what works for you, I think you should run it. And I think LPVOs are a good option. And they are an excellent optic choice. But there are some considerations I think you should make before making that choice, especially if you're going to add a red dot offset optic. Once that comes into the equation, a lot of things stop making as much sense as they did before. And a lot of other problems start to come up that you don't necessarily have to deal with anymore because you already have a good 1x solution. And that's just where I've been trying to figure everything out. And that's where this entire journey has led me to, of running a very good, very high quality LPVO for the past year, which I've greatly enjoyed. And I do not have anything really overly bad to say about this optic. It is very well made, very high quality, and Primary Arms really did knock it out of the park with this one. Did I have a couple of nitpicks to talk about with it? Of course I did. I think you should have nitpicks with everything. Otherwise, you're probably missing something about what's not working right, right? But regardless, this is a great optic. But I'm going back home to ACOG. And I feel really good about it, in all honesty. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you swapped from an LPVO back to an ACOG or maybe even to a more higher power magnification rifle scope? Let me know why. LPVOs have their place 100%. I just don't think they're the right choice for me, especially regarding something like a fighting rifle that might need to be used for that one day. Who knows? I'm curious as to what you think. Maybe I made the wrong decision. Tell me that in the comments as well. Of course, in the description, there are links that you can use to help support the channel. There's Subscribe Star, which is $5 a month, but comes with some perks, including some things that I'm going to be talking about over there and not here. And we also have a Discord and everything else that you can find from my website, magicprepper.com. So make sure you check that out. Anything else you need from me at all, you know how to find me. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper. I'm out.